Okay, right. Joseph, I'm going to leave you in charge of letting people in, and we're going to get started because there's lots of great stories and I want to make sure we have time for them. So, welcome everyone to our session on Path to CMO. I'm Nicola, partner at Growth & Co. and ex full-time recovering CMO and sometimes do some fractional CMO work too. Well, I'm delighted to welcome three very talented CMOs who are going to be sharing their stories about their route to CMO. They're going to give you the inside info on what it's really like and share some tips and insights on how not just to get there, but also be successful in that role. Now, before I go over to our panelists, it would be great if you could all introduce yourselves in chat. Don't worry if you're having lunch at the same time, no problem. You can keep your camera off. And also just to hear about your career aspirations, existing CMO, thinking about going there, lots of questions, so want to know more, or absolutely not for me, but I'd still like to understand what it's like. So we're going to chat for about 45 minutes and we'll make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A. So do ask questions as we go and we'll try and get to as many of them at the end as we can. So without further ado, let's get some intros. Gaston, with the beautiful artwork behind us, tell us a little bit about you.
Yes, I'm not such a big fan of fruit and veg that I have a lot of artwork on my house. It's just the office. So I am the CGO, actually, not CMO at Oddbox. So it's my first chief growth officer role. And actually, I was recruited by Joseph and Nicola for this role. So definitely, you guys probably are familiar with it. I'm really enjoying it. I am now 7 months in Oddbox. Oddbox, for those of you who don't know it, rescue fruit and veg. So what we do is we rescue fruit and veg that otherwise could be at risk of going to waste. 40% of fruit and veg globally goes to waste, although it's perfectly edible. And it's just because the size, the shape is not what supermarkets want, which is, of course, really bad as well when it comes to carbon emissions and the climate. So what we do is we rescue them and we sell them D2C. And previous experiences, I used to work at Google in marketing roles. I was marketing lead for Google for startups globally here in London. And then after Google, I went into different scale-ups startups. I was CMO for the Do Group, which is now Bumble Group, so dating apps. After dating, I went into sleep tech with Emma. So I was CMO for Emma. And this, as I mentioned, is my first chief growth officer role. Lots to talk about between differences between CMOs and CGOs, but yeah, very happy to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Gaston. So always in B2C. And yeah, we're definitely going to be quizzing you on the CMO versus CGO. Elena, tell us about you.
Hi everyone. So I'm Elena. I'm the CMO of Brief, HR software for SMEs. We are one of the leading HR softwares in the UK. So lots of people are, who are you guys? We've never heard about you, but we are actually in the top two HR softwares for SMEs in the UK. I've been with the business for 15 months now, and it's my first CMO role and the first role in a private equity owned business. So CMO plus private equity comes with its own challenge. At Brief, I'm looking after the PLG and marketing-led acquisition motions, covering kind of the direct acquisition of customers, but also partner marketing and working very closely with the product team on kind of creating the right things for the customers. So I'm very lucky because the role itself is very well-rounded, like the traditional CMO role that everyone knows about. I'm not being pigeonholed into driving leads, which is good. But it's been a journey so far and very different from what I've done before. Before I used to started kind of at Facebook in London, and then kind of moved into a mix of roles in B2B and B2C. And one of the roles was within Deliveroo, and they got bought by DoorDash today. They announced this. I finally can sell my options. So woohoo!
I did not know that. Can't believe I missed that one. I'm going to have to go down a black hole and check that out later. But congratulations, that's fantastic news. And hopefully some good upside for you there too.
I hope so as well. I need to check how many options I have left, but
Well, darling, after that breaking news, tell us about you.
Cheers, Nicola. Marketers are storytellers, so I'm going to tell you my story as a story. And to make it even more interesting, I'm going to tell it backwards. So I'm currently living happily ever after as a fraction and advisory CMO. Every year, I fight a battle against marketing dysfunction and turn around a dysfunctional marketing team over the course of about 12 months. Hercules did it 12 times. I'm a weakling, so I've only done it 10 times with companies like Tide, the business challenger bank, Mollie, who are a payments unicorn mostly in Benelux, and Algolia, who are a global SaaS unicorn. As well as working as an interim CMO, I'm increasingly a secret friend to CMOs and CEOs, acting as a mentor and advisor. And once upon a time, I worked in big tech, a bit like Elena and Gaston. I was at Google like Gaston, and that's where it all began for me.
Jalin, I love that. I feel like there's a sort of five dysfunctions of a team fable coming out soon. I'm waiting for this. Well, Elena, you mentioned that you've now been at Breathe for 15 months and it was your first CMO gig. Would love to hear how that transition's been.
It's been interesting, quite challenging. The way I would describe it is the switch between head of marketing to CMO was like driving a very quick speed car, and then suddenly overnight you have to fly a plane. It's kind of both are challenging and both are interesting, but the responsibility in the second instance is 10 times higher because you're responsible for everyone in the plane, not just for yourself. And with this comes changes in your job role as well. And the biggest learning for me in this transition was commerciality. When I was at Deliveroo, the goal was put fuel onto the rocket, which is already flying. Let's go to IPO. At Learnerbly, from Series A to Series B, you don't have budget. How do you actually get the transition? Whereas here, you have the budget, you have the rocket, but the challenge is the question I get every single day. Well, what is the return on investment? Even if you have the budget, you cannot invest it until you actually prove that it's worth investing it. So what I've learned, and the biggest kind of transition for me in terms of how I present myself as a leader, is how do I talk about marketing through the lens of numbers? And this is something that I wish I knew a bit earlier, but luckily I've kind of learned it now. And when I sit at the table, I don't even think about marketing. I think about the business as a whole. And yeah, just kind of the brain itself, the chemicals of the brain have changed in terms of how I view the situation.
And then you wrote a really lovely LinkedIn post about doing this webinar and you talked about the imposter syndrome. I know that that's something that quite a few of our audience have suffered from and think about, the very thought of moving into that CMO role. How did you handle that? And how long did it take you till you felt settled?
Um, I think the imposter syndrome was massively triggered as well by the title. Everyone thinks that, oh my God, if you have a CMO title, this is who you need to be. And I had a certain perception of what it was supposed to be, this perfect leader and know everything, expert, and can influence and motivate everyone at the same time. But you very quickly come to realize that when you're at the table with the C-suite and you close the door, everyone is figuring it out. And what I realized is, okay, if no one knows, what I can do better is how quickly can I figure it out? And I've made sure that I have support network. I hired a coach. I had these conversations which would snap me out of the thinking that I'm not worth it or like I shouldn't be in this position and actually focus on how can I get better in my job on a daily basis, this 1% better every week. And with time, I realized is that with every single win I was having as a professional, but also every single win I was having in terms of change of mindset had actually helped. And the secret was for me is to recognize it because lots of people have the wins, but they don't recognize it. And I have proactively sat down every day and I was like, okay, this is what I've done. And it took a while. I think it took about 11 to 12 months and probably a few kind of very low points of almost burnt out situations. but I've arrived to the point where I'm actually more secure in who I am and what I'm doing. But it wasn't on my own. As I said, it was purely from the support system around me.
Oh, Lena, so much valuable stuff in there. I love that point about it's not having to know everything. It's about when you don't, how quickly you can upskill and really work out what you do need to do and what you do need to know.
Yeah,
So
this
valuable.
is the only, from what I've noticed, this is the only thing that made a difference. And when I speak to my peers, it's also the same thing. It's like, okay, no one really knows it, but I've managed to figure it out and I have a framework system of learning very quickly.
Yeah, it's that problem solving ability.
Yeah.
Gaston, you joined Oddbox just under 6 months ago, and I think this is your fourth, I'm going to call it C-suite, because it's the CGO, not a CMO role. I'd love to hear about the similarities and differences you've seen between being a CMO in different companies, and then we can come on to the CMO versus CGO.
Yes, I think the first thing is when you are a C-suite, you're expected to contribute to the business, no matter what's your functional contribution to it. So I think in the end, it doesn't matter a lot whether it's like CMO or CGO. It's really how you can contribute to that C-suite to build the business in a sustainable way and to advance the business with, of course, your functional skill set, but you're expected to do way more than just being a marketeer or a growth specialist. In my C-level roles, I learned a lot. The first one, I actually almost took it as a risk. I was very, very happy at Google. I was leading Google for Startups, which is a division of Google that supports different startups across the world. It was really, really exciting as a role because you manage to get to know lots of growth stage startups, advise them on growth strategies, and also it was like traveling globally and seeing different startup ecosystems. So it was my perfect dream role. And then suddenly I got an offer to be the CMO of what was called at that point Badoo Group, which is now Bumble Group. It was a very fast growing dating app group. And I was definitely not prepared for it. And I still remember when I accepted that offer, I was shaking. It was literally, I was on a business trip in Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. And then suddenly I was like, I have to make a decision. Do I accept this role or do I stay at Google? And it was basically the worst. I remember like the worst snowstorm in the UK for quite lots of years. So I was asking my partner, like, can you come to Barcelona so we can spend the weekend together and we can discuss this decision? And he was almost not able to travel because of the snowstorm. He made it last minute. And I remember like he came and saw me and he said like, oh my God, what's going on? Like, what happened to you? And I was really having to make this decision. Like, do I leave Google? Do I go for a CMO role? And I made the decision to jump into it and take the risk. But it was definitely a decision that I think a lot of it was around, I'm going to learn a lot from it. Even if it goes wrong, I'm more interested in what I learn. And I learned a lot from that experience. I think particularly what I learned from that experience is that for me, company culture is really important. And values of the company are as important as the product. And then I think I took that learning to future C-level roles.
Oh, Gaston, I so agree with you on that shaking thing. I remember when I got offered the job at my tutor and I was in Paris walking down the street and I wasn't expecting it. And I suddenly realized I was sat on the pavement. I just literally sunk down and was like, oh, because it's that decision. What do I do next? So yeah, I'm absolutely with you there. And Jalin, tell us about you as I believe the UK's most experienced fractional.
Uh, no idea where you got that stat from, and if it
Definitely
weren't for the
accurate.
quality of if it weren't for the quality of video, you'd see me blushing very, very hard at this point. Um, so, so is the question about why fractional versus permanent, or how I got into this? I guess I'm
Yeah,
going
the
to.
question the question is really about you've taken a very specific career route going into the fractional space. What made you focus on this versus full time, and what do you think are the pros and cons?
Uh, I think the question is best looked at through the eyes of founder. So for founders, when they're starting their company and getting it going, for them, it's their baby. It's the most important thing in their life. They're totally, totally obsessed with it. And if you're there as a proper C-level exec next to them, you are a co-parent in this very, very intense nurturing process for their baby. and you end up having, at a professional level, a very intense relationship with the founder if you're a C-level exec. And I went through that. So after I left Google 10 years ago, and it wasn't quite as dramatic as Mobile World Congress and trying to make minds up, in an instant, in a flurry of, in a blizzard of snow and everything. But I left Google, joined a company 10 years ago, and I was permanent CMO and COO over there. So I remember at Google, I'd written this kind of career plan thing. There's a career planning framework, PDPs, whatever it was, Gaston, back in the day. And I'd written in my PDP that at one stage I want to be CMO and COO of such and such a hot, fast-growing company. I was, and I managed to do it far, far earlier than I'd anticipated. I'd given a 10-year timeline for this thing, and it happened 3-4 years after I wrote the plan. So I was in this role, and it was the worst experience I had in my life because the founder was just horrendous. He was incredibly charismatic, very convincing, had lots of money thrown at him, and he was the star of the UK fintech scene 10 years ago, 12 years ago. But the relationship between me and him, I mean, it was like being in an abusive relationship. So he really, really cared about his baby, and no one was ever going to do enough for his baby and do as much as he was able to do. And he really resented that. So being in this abusive relationship at a sort of professional level, I remember the guy shouting down the phone at me in Greenwich Park when I had my son on my shoulders. He was 2 years old at that point, and I mean, it was absolutely horrendous. So I left the place, and I remember doing calculations as I was leaving before the 12-month point about, for every day that I stayed on and got the kind of option vesting cliff, how much was it going to be, and how much was it going to be worth based on this scenario and that scenario. I just couldn't convince myself, having £1,000 a day were at stake, that my sanity was worth it. So I almost walked out of the place. And at that point, I wanted to stay in the startup scene. It's very, very, as all of you know, it's incredibly intoxicating. It's exciting to move at that pace and have that level of exposure to the founding spirit and the vision behind the thing. So I wanted to stay in the space, but not expose myself to all of the risks, the downsides, the pain that went with it. So I muddled my way into this kind of interim and fractional and advisory career. And initially, I had not much idea of what I was doing other than mitigating a whole load of risks. So all of the motivations were sort of downside risk mitigation, about not wanting to work more than 4 days a week so that I didn't end up getting totally chewed up like the previous time. Not being in a position where you're reliant on one founder for the next 4 or 5 years, and every time they give you a funny look, you sleep really badly for 2 nights afterwards and the rest of it. So that was the motivation, and then I've ended up making a career of it, and it's been a hell of a lot of fun. So thinking about the pros and cons, you've got a lot more psychological control. You learn a lot faster because you're exposing yourself to a new product, a new audience every year, or whatever the frequency is. And financially, it can be, depending on your practice, more cash, less equity, but there's a very large distribution around that. For some people, they make very little money because they're underutilized, and then there's a small number of people making an incredible amount of money. So that's yeah, I guess, potted history of how I got there and some of the pros and cons.
What do you think is the biggest negative? Have there been any moments when you thought, actually, I'd like to go back full time?
Definitely the most nerve-wracking aspect is biz dev. So when you finish a big gig and you've got nothing, or you haven't done biz dev for a while, getting the engine going again and doing biz dev for yourself, which, I mean, it's a downside because there's no income coming in and you're trying to work out when the next piece comes. But it's also good because you're marketing yourself and you're doing GTM and lead gen for yourself. So putting into practice for yourself what you've done for others is it's really rewarding. But yeah, it is definitely nerve-wracking. Although when you're doing it for the 5th time or the 10th time, and you know what it's going to play, how it's going to play out statistically, it's far more reassuring than when you do it for the first time, the second time.
And Jalin, what would you say is the most career-defining moment in that career? Was it when you had that revelation that actually I just don't want to be in this business anymore with this pretty aggressive founder?
Probably the first that. So I think the definitive, the turning point for me as an interim CMO is when I did my first interim CMO gig, and I somehow sold this thing and walked into a company. It was actually a challenger bank called Pocket that's recently been in the news because it bought another challenger bank, Mollie. So I was Pocket CMO 10 years ago, interim CMO. And I walked in thinking, okay, I've landed this gig and I'm really delighted that I'm doing my first interim CMO role, having walked away from this kind of quasi-abusive relationship a couple of months earlier. But being on a day rate where you're often paid more than anyone else in the building, you know nothing about the audience, you know nothing about the product. There's this huge sense of, as Elena was saying, imposter syndrome. You're being paid a lot, you know nothing. So how do you add value when you know nothing and the expectations are high? And that forced me to develop some systems for things like I started running my team with roadmaps and sprints. I started relating everything we were doing in marketing to three levers that were just a decomposition of revenue. So along the lines of acquisition, conversion, which included the website and product marketing, and then customer marketing for retention, cross-sell, and upsell. So I related everything to those three levers. I had roadmaps and sprints. Later, I repositioned the company and the brand and the rest of it. And that was all a response to being forced to add value or feeling this strong obligation to add value when you don't have any domain knowledge to start with. And that became the foundation for this playbook that I've then run with 10, 12 companies since, and that I'm now spreading further and further.
Yeah, and it's pretty fabulous. If anyone hasn't seen it, Jalin did a webinar with us a while ago on roadmap and sprints, and he may well share the video if you ask nicely. It's so good. Elena, for you, what do you think was the most career-defining moment for you?
It was the first time I stepped away from the corporate life and moved into the startup world. So I was at Deliveroo and I got two job offers. One with Go Cardless, where Nicola, probably you were there at the time, maybe not. No. And the second one was with a seed stage startup called Dame that Joseph helped me. She recruited me to that business. So I went through an excruciating process of deciding which one to go for. The Go Cardless, which was incredibly secure, and you have the frameworks and you have the support, or you go into Dame, where I got the job as a head of growth, and I had to figure it all out on my own. I'm very security driven. I come from Eastern Europe. We love security. So it wasn't an easy decision for me. But again, try to understand kind of the pros and the cons. And my mentor back then told me, look, you're still young. If you fail in this job in Dame, what's the worst that can happen? You don't have kids, you don't have family, like just do it. And I think taking that risk actually is what opened all the doors afterwards. Because if you want to go to a CMO role, you need to operate in an uncertain environment. And that was the first kind of school of life where I learned you come in, everything is a bit mass. You have to create a strategy. You deal with different difficult personalities, with different opposing views. And that kind of learning curve is what kick-started the whole process to me becoming the CMO. And I always kind of refer back to that experience. It's like now I have to figure out brand. And I remember talking about brand and dealing with brand and Dame. So I think that was the particular moment that changed everything. Because if I was a Go Carless now, for sure, I would have not been a CMO. Like in corporate, it's way more difficult to learn as much about the business, but also to grow in the business.
I love this story because it's so back to front to me because I had to make like my hardest decision was going whether I went to Go Carders, which was 30 people, no one had ever heard of it. And they were like, direct debit, boring. Or do I go to Charlotte Tilbury, glamorous makeup brand? And I just remember my boss at me going, this is the maddest decision I've ever heard. Why on earth are you going to this random, weird direct debit company instead of this lovely, glamorous, shiny thing? But there was some gut feel that just made it feel right. So yeah, way before you started speaking to them, Elena. Gaston, what about you? Most defining moment? Was it a particular role?
I think actually it was more something that I did on the side that then had a massive impact on my marketing career. It was doing a master's in creative writing. So when I was at Google, I decided to do a master's part-time on the side. And I remember I applied for two different masters, one in creative writing and the other one in computer science, like nothing to do with each other. And then when I got admitted, I remember having a discussion with my manager at the time, and she was, do whatever you think, you would find more interesting. And at that point, I decided to do a master's in creative writing, not really because of my marketing career. It's because I love writing and I always loved writing. So I said, like, let's just do it. Let's actually see how that can impact as well my writing in general. And it gave me so many amazing frameworks to judge creativity. I think in general, I think there's a lot of discussions in the marketing industry around storytelling, and I would say 90% of it is just pure bullshit. It's actually not real like storytelling advice. It's just, these kind of like business gurus trying to explain storytelling, and they have never written a single story in their lives. Was I think what I learned from my master's in creative writing. It was really from writers. I had a tutor who was the screenwriter of Life on Mars, and he worked with me for a whole year on a script for a web series. And I learned so much from those tutors and those professors on what actually makes a good story. And I think now whenever I judge a marketing creative, I do with the same lens that I would judge a fiction story. And I think it gave me a lot of really interesting tools for my marketing career.
Great advice. And you heard just from Jalin when he started talking, he was telling a story about his career versus just the bullet points. So important at every level. Gaston, is there going to be a book on the side at some point?
I am working on one. So yes, I publish in Spanish and now I'm working on a novel in English. So that's going to be hopefully the next.
Well, I hope that Growth & Co are going to get the insights and updates when it's coming out, please. First to know. And just sticking with you, that was obviously a fantastic choice and it has really helped you define your career. What about the most difficult choices you've had to make in this whole journey?
I think usually as a CMO, one of the most difficult, challenging decisions that you have to make is around restructuring and letting people go, either because of performance or because of how the roles are not contributing anymore to the strategy. I think it's quite obvious when you have to make those decisions from a business point of view, but from a human perspective, they never become easier. I think it's always challenging. I think aside from those human decisions when it comes to just the team setup, one of the most difficult decisions I had to make was when I decided to leave Bumble and Badoo as a company. That was my first CMO role, and I absolutely loved the product. The product was so interesting. Dating in general is like one of the most fascinating industries. I still remember like every Friday, the data science team would send these reports that would be like dating insights. And I could literally not wait, like, to get a data insight report. Like, I don't think that happens in many companies, but you learn so much about human behavior. So it was the perfect role from like storytelling, creative perspective. The product was growing, the company was in a really good shape. But I think culturally, that company didn't reflect my values, and I had to make the tough decision of leaving, although it was a perfect role from all other perspectives. But similar to what Jalin mentioned, I think like definitely you need to make sure that the company you choose is aligned with your values and what you really, really want to bring to work. Because I think if not, you're just gonna not bring your best self, and I think you're not going to perform as well, like as you can do in other companies. So that was one of my most difficult decisions, having to leave a company that I was really enjoying from a business point of view, but not enjoying from a cultural point of view.
I think it's a really important point as well, because sometimes when you get offered a job and it's a promotion, like my first CMO role, you're so excited about the opportunity that you don't necessarily do the appropriate due diligence on it. How do you really determine whether there is a good value and culture fit? How did you work that out at, say, Oddbox?
Yes. So I now do a lot of due diligence. I think when I left Google, I was very naive, if I'm honest. I feel like Google in general has a pretty good culture. Although like you're gonna read a lot of reports in the media about like, how horrible certain teams are. I think in general it has a pretty professional culture and quite good professional values, I would say, across the organization. Whereas the startups, as you probably everyone know, like here, it's the Wild West, right? Some are gonna be great, some are gonna be like crazy founders who are gonna shout, some others are gonna be even worse than that. So I think you need to do your due diligence. One thing I have done like consistently after that experience is definitely reach out to previous employees and previous CMOs. Already, of course, red flags if like you have CMOs who have stayed there for like 6 months, one after the other, you kind of know that there is an issue. And then I think secondly, what I try to do with certain roles is offer them to start as a consultant. So you don't commit full time. And so I didn't do that, for example, with Oddbox because I already had a pretty good impression. But with companies that I'm a bit on the fence, I would be like, why don't we start with a 2-week like consulting period, fractional, we see how that works, and then we can both judge if this is the right fit. And then you can actually judge in those 2 weeks way more than with any interviews, how's the culture of that company. But I think it's really, really important because as a leader, you have to represent the values of the company. So it's not the same as, being an employee who is not happy with a company. Like as a CMO, you are most likely going to be the spokesperson as well for the company. So if you cannot really defend the values of that company, I think, it's up to you as a professional, but it's really hard to stay in a place that you don't believe in the culture of that company.
Yeah, such a good takeaway there. However exciting the role might be, always check that there's that fit and some great ideas of how to do that. Thank you, Gaston. Elena, what about you? Most difficult choice you've had to make?
I'm gonna have to jump on Gaston's answer. The most challenging one, it's always the team restructure. And this is what I was naive about before. I always thought you were given time to do team restructures, but once you join a new business in a leadership role, you're actually expected to make this impact very, very quickly. You're given like 1 to 3 months, and boom, what's your strategy? What's your new org? Whom you're gonna let go, whom you're gonna keep, and so on and so forth. And it's not the actual process that is difficult. It's mostly your human side of things. Are you making the right choices within the 3 months or not? And I think from the personal perspective, when you're in that role, it's excruciating in terms of the process. It's do you trust yourself or not? Have you assessed things or not? Because it's going to have impact on the team members, and so on and so forth. So if I had to give one piece of advice for everyone who hasn't done team restructures or gone through change management process, it's try to find these opportunities and participate in it. Because what I've learned from my experience is it does come with experience. The more often you do, the quicker you can spot the gaps. And whether it's your proper assessment or kind of not proper assessment, you're going to be able to see the difference between these two. And then number 2 is, if you don't have the opportunity to participate in this kind of process, try to learn from others. Join webinars, read about it. But this kind of change management and transformation of teams in a very short period of time, I think, is crucial to be successful in the first 3 months as a CMO.
Thank you. Some really good advice there, Elena. And Jalin, for you, as fractional, what's been some of the most difficult decisions you've had to make? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. So yeah, a situation I've been in repeatedly that is specific to being a fractional CMO, but that has, I think, an applicability, or it's got applications by analogy that I'll get to in a second. So as a fractional, I've been offered full-time CMO roles at the companies where I've been a fractional a few times. And particularly the first couple of times, it forced lots of thinking and consideration because I'd seen the company I think at least one of those times I thought this is a decent company, and the reason eventually that I didn't go for it, and I'm very unlikely to go for it, is that after lots of introspection, it felt to me that different people are suited to different situations. So when you're a permanent CMO, maybe it's like being a marathon runner, and I'm more of a sprinter or a middle distance runner. I'd rather stay at a company for a year and notice. I've done about 10 of these turnaround interim CMO gigs, and almost every single one of them has ended up being for about 12 months. So I think that is my distance. That's my kind of temperament. Once it gets a lot longer than that, I get slightly itchy feet. If it's shorter than that, it doesn't feel satisfying enough. So I think the broader point is about trying to work out for yourself, not what you think you ought to be doing, but genuinely in your soul, what you need to be doing to be happy and satisfied and matched to the opportunity in front of you. And that might be about stage of business. I'm working, mentoring someone at the moment and paid by the company to mentor the CMO. He's very clear. He's a C to Series B specialist, and he wants to take companies through that journey, one after the other, and he wants to get them there as quickly as possible. Your specialization might be about stage, it might be about industry. I spent a lot of time in fintech, and I realized that I was one of the few marketers that loved fintech and loved marketing, and it just created this endless stream of work for me when there was this fintech boom over the last decade or so. The broader point is just being introspective and trying to work out in quite a lot of detail what your match is, independently of what you theoretically think it should be.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I don't know how many of you listen to Exit 5, but Dave Gerhardt talks a lot about how he always thought it was CMO. And then he got there and realized he really didn't enjoy it. It wasn't his thing. And so immediately went off and did something else. So it's not necessary, there's no standard or like, this is the script, you have to go to CMO next. It's what feels right for you. And just continuing with you, Jalin, what do you think is the biggest misconception about the CMO role? Because you've obviously seen this in multiple different companies.
What gets you to CMO is being a good marketer, whereas being a great CMO is a different skill set. So I think that the mistake is to focus lots and lots on the actual marketing and the tactics and the quality of execution. It's important, but the critical skills are different. And just to give a flavor for some of these critical skills, and Elena had mentioned, Elena and Gaston have talked about them as well. So Elena spoke about the ROI obsession and the first team, and Gaston also spoke about duty to the organization. So building on that a bit, I think as CMO, you've got your domain of responsibility is your budget, your team, and your portfolio of initiatives at a team level. So with the budget, you've got to work out how to deploy it. Everyone thinks about channels. No one thinks about, or lots of people don't think about other dimensions, like how you spread it across the funnel. Should you be doing lots of customer marketing and things at the bottom of the funnel, very bottom of the funnel after sign up? Or should you be doing very, very upper funnel things, brand awareness and so on? So there are dimensions of allocation like that are neglected. There's another dimension as well, by the way, which is team versus initiatives. So if you're having a very high trust conversation with the CEO and CFO, I think you should be able to say, I want to spend less on media and creative and the rest of it, more on really high quality people, because it's all coming from the same pot of money ultimately, even though people pretend that headcount is a different pot of money, it's not really ultimately. So that goes back to the whole budgeting conversation. I think budgeting and the way that you allocate your money is incredibly important. Second is how you deploy your team and organize your team. And I'm a big believer in organizing it against levers of revenue. So whatever the levers are, whatever the breakdown is that makes sense in that business, whether it's a marketplace, so you might have two different sides of the marketplace and two different halves of your marketing team. But whatever the drivers are, have, I'd say, max 3 drivers of revenue and arrange your team, kind of align them and deploy them very explicitly against them. It'll make the team's efforts more efficient, and it'll make it easier to communicate what marketing is doing to drive revenue for the business. So we've covered budget allocation, team, and then the third thing is portfolio of initiatives. I think it's, again, worth thinking systematically about what your team is doing quarter to quarter, and that's where roadmaps and sprints or any kind of methodology like that, the lightweight agile methodology I run, that's one way to do it. There are probably others as well, but the point is to be thinking about the portfolio of initiatives as clearly and deliberately as your product team will be thinking about their portfolio of feature building and all the rest of it. So I think that's the domain of what you're doing as a CMO. And then the sort of soft side next to it is stakeholder management. And that's possibly 50% of your job. And sometimes it feels like a pain in the arse. Sometimes it feels like this is politics. It is still 50% of your job.
Thanks, Jalin. Elena, 15 months in, was that one of the biggest surprises for you or the biggest misconceptions you felt, like that whole stakeholder management piece?
No, I think that was something I expected, and because of my previous jobs, I had to leverage it a lot to get what I needed to do. I think the biggest misconception for me was everyone expects that your first team, your main team, is marketing team because you have marketing in your title, but actually your peers, your C-suite is your first team. Your exec team is your first team. In the CMO role, you're no longer responsible just for marketing. You're responsible for the business. So when you think about marketing, as Jalin said, you're thinking about it through the perspective of the funnels, the whole ecosystem, and how can you support your peers if the impact on the business is going to be higher there. So this was the biggest learning, and kind of trying to communicate to the marketing team to your team, kind of the secondary team, why certain decisions have to be made in a certain way to benefit the business, but it's not necessarily benefiting marketing today. This was something that I had to learn, but the team now understands kind of what we are striving for is the revenue for the business and how we win as a whole business rather than just an individual department.
Yeah, so important, that overall North Star. I remember I moved 500,000 of marketing budget into product because we had some major product problems. And I was thinking, crikey, this is a very much a business focused decision versus a marketing one. And if anyone hasn't read it, I highly recommend Five Dysfunctions of a Team, which really talks about your leadership team being your number one team and how challenging it can be to shift your mindset to that. Gaston, I'm going to ask you two questions around this, like your biggest misconception about the CMO role and also the CMO versus CGO role.
Yeah, I think in general with the CMO role and why it's such a challenging role is because the expectations are either wildly ambitious, and as a CMO, you're expected to deliver all the growth of the company and you're responsible for like every single top line kind of like metric. And we all know that is not true, right? Like it's not just marketing or growth levers within marketing that are going to drive that. And although as a marketeer and even as a CGO, you should definitely care about product, most likely product and particularly software engineers are not reporting to you. So you're influencing the tech team, the product team cross-functionally, but they have a massive impact when it comes to growth. So I feel like it's either wildly ambitious, people expect you to deliver all growth, when a big part of it will also depend on the product, on the quality of the service, on the customer service. And those functions do not report necessarily to you, but you need to influence them very, very effectively. Or the opposite, which is also equally frustrating as a CMO, when the expectations are really low and marketing is just expected to like bring a nice slide template, for the board meeting. Sometimes I get that question, like, sometimes ask me like, what is the template for slides? I'm like, I'm not sure, like just, use this one, but it's not my role to be like, the font in your like slide is not on brand. So I think like, is that what you really need to work on as a CMO, is making sure the expectations of what marketing will deliver are at the right altitude, not too high because it's going to basically set you up for failure and you're not going to be able to move all the different levers for growth in the business, but also not so low that is quite demoralizing. I spoke a lot about that. I'm not sure if there's time still to speak about differences between CMO and CGO. Yep.
Yes, please do share your thoughts, having been CMO and CGO. And I know Joseph has written a couple of articles on this on LinkedIn, lots of feedback there. What do you think, and what have you seen are the main differences between being the CGO and the CMO?
I saw a lot of heated debates on LinkedIn with Joseph, so I'm going to add more heat to these debates.
Yes, we always like that bit of controversy.
Yes. I think in the end, I think as I mentioned at the beginning, as a C-level, you're expected to drive business value. And when I join a business, I'm not thinking, oh, I am the marketeer, so that's not my area. I'm like, whatever needs to be fixed, I'm going to flag it. If I have the skills to fix it, I'm going to do it. If not, I'm going to find the right person to fix it. And sometimes that goes beyond your own remit. I have done stuff that has nothing to do with marketing or growth just because the company needed it. Like I shaped, for example, the fundraising narrative for my previous startup. I'm not a chief strategy officer, but there was no one really there to think about that. And, it was part of my contribution to the C-level role, thinking about how we can make this business succeed. So in the end, it doesn't really matter that much whether a name is Chief Marketing Officer, Chief Growth Officer, Chief Customer Officer, which was fashionable, I think 5 years ago. Now it went out of fashion. It's really about how you can contribute to the business with your skill set. I would say that the issue I see with the Chief Growth Officer role is that as a role title is a bit more misleading compared to Chief Marketing Officer. The reason is that growth in the end comes from all functions. Like growth is not just purely a marketing function. Finance is also a growth function, but finance doesn't report to me. Engineering should be a growth function, but it doesn't report to me. So what I see with a Chief Growth Officer role title is that sometimes other functions, it's not that they become lazy, but they say, well, there is a function called growth. They are the ones supposed to drive growth. And I don't think it's the right message to the business. And I have been actually discussing it actively in Oddbox to make sure accountability is clear. But for example, one thing I see with the Chief Growth Officer role title when I joined Oddbox is that the operations team was kind of like asking me, should we expand to new postcodes or not? And I'm like, of course we should. Like from a growth perspective, it's a no-brainer. What you should analyze is what's the ROI of that postcode expansion. But you shouldn't expect the chief growth officer who doesn't even handle operations to make that decision. Like it should be a business-wide decision. Everything that drives growth, we should do it. So I think like chief growth officer, similar to chief customer officer, I think they're pretty poorly defined role titles because everything should be the customer, everything should be growth. And I think in my role, what I'm doing is, of course, influencing growth across the board, but the levers that I have reporting directly to me are marketing levers, and the other levers I will definitely influence, but every C-level should be accountable for growth. It's not just the CGO.
Yeah, and I think you've raised a really interesting point. It's less about the title, it's really about what you're contributing. So we're rapidly running out of time because you guys have got so many interesting stories and insights. So just a couple more questions and then take a couple of questions from the audience. Elena, if you could go back to when you were head of marketing, what's one thing you wish you'd known then that you know now? Anything that you would have upskilled in or dealt with differently?
I think my background is in growth, and I always thought that you can be a CMO and you're going to do growth. Actually, you have to be a very well, like all-rounder person and professional to be a good CMO. So with the background in growth, what I've learned is that I'm definitely missing experience in brand. And for someone else, they're going to have experience in brand, they're going to have to learn about growth. So it's never this, when I was kind of a younger professional, there was always this battle. Do we do this or do we do this? Actually, you have to have an understanding of everything in marketing. Yeah, you don't have to be an expert, but you should know enough to be able to create a strategy to guide your team and to see where to deploy the budgets or how to test certain ideas. And so this was kind of the biggest learning. But I would probably tell myself back then, don't ignore brand, because I was always thinking that it's this fluffy thing that I'm not interested in. But definitely kind of get more interested in it and learn more about it before I stepped into this role. Now I just had to kind of learn on the flight and just pull all my networking. It's like, okay, how did you do it? But yeah, at the same time, despite me doing that, it's impossible for one human being to know everything in marketing. Like, I think marketing is the only function that covers so many things: performance marketing and brand and social media, blah, blah, blah. So just be kind to yourself and just learn as much as you can and create this framework of learning that's going to help you arrive to a decision quickly when you're dealing with something new.
And that's why having a great network is so important. Because you can say, right, who here's a brand expert? Can I have a 1 hour quick lesson? Or Joseph, can you do a quick webinar on this, please, and find me some great people to learn from? Jalin, what about you?
What do I wish I'd known earlier?
Yeah.
So on the soft side, I wish I'd thought a bit more deliberately about this spectrum between being incredibly optimistic and salesy and telling a good story on the one hand, and being incredibly candid, admitting vulnerability and potential weaknesses with what you're about to do and all of the ways that it could go wrong. So there is this spectrum, and I used to have a default position on that spectrum 10 years ago. This was coming out of Google. I don't know, Gaston, we're in slightly different cohorts at Google, but certainly when I was there, it was an optimistic, salesy place, and people would well schooled in telling a big story, whatever the forum, whatever the situation. So I came into the startup world always telling a big story and being incredibly optimistic about stuff, and it served me, frankly, really badly. So I'd say over time, I've generally migrated further and further towards the vulnerable open end of the spectrum, and that level of candor buys you a lot of credibility, particularly over the long term. But the reality is you are flexing a bit. So when you're in front of the marketing team and you're trying to make them feel good, or I don't know, let's say there's bad news, you've got to kind of deliver the bad news, but retain some hope for the people that are left and things like that. So I think just thinking about that spectrum really quite hard. If I had a default, it would be quite close to the very candid end. But there are plenty of times with the marketing team or others when you need to instill hope and sell a bit of a story as well. So I wish I'd thought about that
Yeah,
a bit
such good advice, particularly in leadership and board meetings. I found that being candid and vulnerable so important. So
Yes.
adjusting how you behave depending on the audience.
That's absolutely right. So, I even want, this probably needs a bit of thinking about, but a rule of thumb might be that the more senior the audience you're dealing with, the more candid you want to be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Gaston, for you?
Yes, I think I was reflecting on like Elena's kind of learning, and I think it's something that I remember when I was at Google, I was quite intentional to pick roles that were either performance or brand, and I would suggest and I would recommend everyone to do that. Like if you're currently in a performance role, if you're in a startup, it's pretty easy to pick up projects on the other side because basically every startup is under resourced and everyone will welcome some level of support. But I think if you're in a big company, think about intentionally picking roles on the other side, because I think you will need both as a CMO. But one thing I didn't know at that point, and it has really been important now, is learning more around corporate finance. I think finance and financial language is the most important language you can speak as a C-level. In the end, what matters is how are you going to make more money and how are you going to lose less money. Like if we actually boil it down to what the board cares about, of course there are reputational issues and there are other things, but in the end it's really around the P&L. I think understanding profits and losses, understanding how you're contributing to it, it's critical. So if you're not familiar with a balance sheet, if you don't know how to read a P&L, go and read it. Like go to, thankfully in the UK, it's all public. So you can just go to Companies House, you can check the P&L of your company or other companies that you admire and learn how to read them and learn a lot around corporate finance because it's going to make you much more, I would say, credible in a C-level space if you understand corporate finance.
Such good advice. I always think make the CFO your best friend. And actually, I found whenever you go to them and say, I'd really like to work through this with you, I'd really like to understand this, they're always absolutely delighted that one, you're interested, two, that you want to learn, and three, that hopefully that will mean they'll get better reporting back and better insight back from marketing. So it's win-win all round. Last question. Given the explosion of AI and all the current challenges in the macro environment, how do you think the role of CMO and CGO is changing? Gaston, I'm going to go back to you.
I'm coming from an AI startup. So before Fractional, I was working in Curio, which is an AI for news. So I would say in general, we will have to really justify our value as professionals way more. So if you thought that it was going to become easier, no, I think it's going to become harder. I think it's going to become harder for all of us to justify why a company is even paying a salary for us. So I know it's quite like blunt to say it, but I think it's important that we're all aware of it. Like as professionals, we will have to justify our value way more than ever before. And you already see some companies doing this, right? I think Shopify has a new policy where if you want to open a new role, you need to justify why AI cannot do it. And I think it's going to become more and more common. So what I would say is like, think proactively how you're going to add value beyond what AI can already do. Because if not, I think most likely CMO roles and marketing roles in general are going to become obsolete. So a lot of hope because I think we're going to be able, hopefully, to add value beyond what AI can do. But also, I think it's a very challenging time, and we all need to think proactively how we can add value.
Great, thank you. Jalin?
I agree strongly with Gaston and just building it on it a bit. So I run my teams, like I was saying earlier, usually organize them in three pillars. And I use those three pillars for everything. All of the roadmaps and sprints are structured around three pillars. All of the executive updates are structured around three pillars. The team is organizationally split into three or more or less three. And I think this is now the time to add a fourth pillar, which is automation. If you're doing that, you will force the automation conversation every time you're road mapping in all of your sprints, in all of your executive updates, and all of your decision making. So it is really deeply important. I think as CMO, the question is, how are you going to embed it into your strategy, your tactics, your team meetings really deeply?
So really make AI one of those pillars. And Elena?
I'm going to build on what has been discussed. I actually
Good.
think that CMOs are going to become more important because someone needs to orchestrate the people, the AI. Someone has to give the strategies to the AI to perform. I think what's going to change is actually going to be the size of the teams. Right now, you already see all these letters coming from CEOs of HubSpot and yada yada, where they say, we're not hiring anymore, figure it out. And I think this is where the difference is going to come. Are teams learning to adapt quickly or not? So this is going to be one big change for CMOs. We're not going to have big teams anymore. It's just going to be like you have ChatGPT and then 5 people. And then the second thing is because everyone is going to be using AI in marketing, I think we're going to see a shift from brand awareness to brand trust. How it's not about building the awareness of your brand, but how when everyone is using the same sources, how do you build a trust and build this relationship with your target audience? And I think there it's not that we haven't done it today, but I think this one is going to be dialed up. It's like all the case studies, all the proof points and everything we're going to have to find them, and to find them it means that the product has to be good. So I think there's going to be an improvement of products in the future, hopefully, to help us marketeers to market something good in the market.
So leadership and strategy is going to become even more important. And actually, it's all about being authentic and having that really strong product market fit. We have 1 minute left. So I'm going to do a quick question for each of you, which has 2 parts, I'm afraid. So we might run over by 1 to 2 minutes. But I would love to know from each of you one top tip for aspiring CMOs and one book, podcast, person to follow on LinkedIn that you recommend as well. So we'll just go in order. Gaston.
I think one tip is definitely develop some hard skills that you think are critical for this role. And I would say something around creative writing or creativity and something around maybe automation, computer science. I think those hard skills actually do contribute as much as like your soft interpersonal skills. And top book, I always recommend the same because I absolutely love it and it changed my views on storytelling. It's a book from Hemingway. It's not actually written by Hemingway, but it kind of like compiles all the best storytelling advice from Hemingway. It's called On Writing by Ernest Hemingway, and it has the best storytelling advice I have ever come across, and I use it all the time to judge marketing creatives.
I love that. I love his writing, but I wasn't aware of that one. It's going to be on the wish list. Elena.
Develop a thick skin. This is my biggest tip. Because no matter what you've heard today, you're gonna have to roll with the punches, and it's gonna be tough, and every single circumstance is different. So just be resilient and don't worry, you're gonna figure it out. And then in terms of what to listen to is Lenny's podcast. You probably listened to it already, but it's the one podcast that gives perspective about the whole business rather than just marketing. And I find that a bit more useful to connect the dots later on in your own business.
Great one. And I'll share all of these in a follow-up email with the recording. Jalin.
So one piece of advice is you've got one key audience as a CMO, that is the CEO. So nurture that relationship. It's unbelievably important. If your messaging is not landing with that key audience, it's going badly wrong. So focus on that relationship, even if it feels obvious. And then the recommendation. So we often feel as marketers that we've found a way of thinking about life through numbers and stories and analyzing whether it's politics and political slogans or all sorts of things through this lens. And other people don't analyze all of life through this very, very interesting lens. Someone who does it really, really well, that some of you might know, is a marketing professor called Scott Galloway, who then looks at the market, politics, family life, male dysfunction, all sorts of issues through the lens of marketing.
I love Scott Galloway, particularly on Pivot. Wonderful. I know we're 1 minute over. Thank you so much, Gaston, Elena, and Jalin, because that was so insightful, so interesting. And it was so lovely hearing such different stories as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you all for joining us. We will share the recording and we will share those books as well and any of the other links that were popped in chat. But really appreciate you taking the time, particularly on the first day after a long weekend. Have a lovely day. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.